It's about 7 o'clock, so it is time for me to get moving here. Yep, everything is looking good. I will go and double check those here in a second, but you all got here for 7 o'clock start, so let's give you a real 7 o'clock start, and I will give an introduction and get out of the way. Let me turn off this screen. Where do I have that control? Here we go. And I'll grab a spotlight for myself. Great. We have somebody who just came into the meeting room, so I'll let them in. And welcome, everybody. I'm so glad you joined us. I'm Clayton Cheever. I'm the Assistant Director at the Thomas Crane Public Library. You may have guessed from my backdrop, I am not in the library this evening. We do have some people in the library this evening because we are scheduling, you can request things and come and pick them up as late as 7:45 is our last, the 7:45 to 8 o'clock is the last one. So there are some people right now, and I was there earlier today, but I'm not there now. I'm home. I hope you all are someplace comfortable. If you're not at home, you're someplace else where you are safe and comfortable, have something nice to drink, and are ready for a fabulous program tonight. If you're here to learn all about yellow fever, the plague that haunted America from John Adams to Bette Davis, you're in the right place. If you're looking for something about smoothies that taste like Girl Scout cookies or music history or any of the other programs that we've been doing recently, well, I encourage you to check out our YouTube channel, or you can see a bunch of them on Facebook as well. But I also encourage you to stick around because it's going to be a great program. I was just alluding to some fabulous programs we've had recently. One of those is a program that we're doing with Professor Del Case, which is a music history program where every Wednesday night this month, we've been going into popular types of music. And we're not doing popular as in country versus rock and roll versus, classical. We're defining types of music as what we do with the music. So the first week we talked about protest music, then we talked about party music. Last week we talked about love songs, and it wasn't just sappy ballads. There's a lot of very interesting love songs on various themes. This week we're talking about dance music. So it's going to be a lot of fun. I encourage you to join us on Zoom or on YouTube or Facebook at 7 o'clock. We are going to be sharing some content for that program that is copyrighted. It's totally fair use to use for educational purposes, but sometimes the robots on YouTube and Facebook get upset at what we're sharing and shut us down on those platforms. So it's always good to join us here on Zoom. I'm pointing out that extra level of detail tonight because we're going to be showing you some content tonight that is also copyrighted. So I will share this Zoom information, this meeting information. Just the meeting ID is all you need to do. If you go out to Zoom and go to join a new meeting, you can put in this meeting ID and join us here on Zoom, and you can join us live. If the robots out there, the robot overlords, decide that they don't like how we're sharing stuff tonight, it may get yanked off of YouTube or Facebook, but we'll be live here. We've never had a problem with Zoom supporting this educational content. So please do join us here on Zoom if you have any problems on the other platforms. But, fingers crossed, we'll be great across everything. So just so glad you could join us. A couple of procedural elements that I just want to go over. We will be running this program in spotlight mode. As I mentioned, we are streaming it to several services. Your video could be shared across the internet. So if you have your video on, just be aware of that. I will be spotlighting just the person who's speaking right now in the spotlight. But if you are joining us on Zoom, you can swipe through. There's different ways to see different presenter views on Zoom. So if you aren't familiar with how to use Zoom, I encourage you can play with the controls now, or you can talk to us afterwards. I think when the program's going on, you probably just want to figure out how to focus on the person who's talking, which I'll try to do and make as easy as possible. If you're having challenges today, that might be a good reason to go out and check out what's happening on YouTube or Facebook as well. I don't encourage doing both at once because there is a slight delay because of the technology between when we say things here on Zoom and when they're heard on the platform. So just choose one is my advice. You can do multiple. I will be doing multiple. If you have any comments or questions, you can put them in the chat. I'll put a note in the chat so you can see a little window pop up that tells you that there's been a chat message. When I use the chat, I'll also be watching the chat on YouTube and Facebook on these devices here. I'll have the volume turned off so we won't all get driven crazy by the sound. So I think that's it. If you have any technical questions, please feel free to reach out to me on the chat and I'll do my best to help you out. And I can't think of anything else to say. So I'm just so excited to have Ed and Alexandra from the Quincy Historical Society joining us tonight. And I will pass the spotlight, I think, to Ed first. And I will be working on passing the spotlight between the two of them. Ed, good evening. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Clayton. Thanks for hosting this once again. I suppose the first thing we should do is see if I have the technical chops to get the slideshow up, so that we don't waste time on that later. How does that look to people? Are people seeing that, or did
we don't have it yet? I think if you checked both boxes and then you have to hit the share screen again one more time.
All right.
They make it tricky. They make us press all sorts of buttons and levers to make this work.
Okay, let's see what we can do here. Okay, so what do we want to do? We want to hit share screen once again. And we got that. And we got that. We're getting there?
It looks good. And then you just want to launch your program and you're good to go.
And here we go. Maybe. There we are. Okay, everybody still with us?
Ta-da! Yep, you're looking golden.
Okay, so this is not exactly a sequel to the terrific program that Alexandra did a couple of months ago on the 1918 flu epidemic in Quincy, but it kind of got inspired by that. And we sort of began from the point of thinking about the fact that John Adams was president during during a number of the yellow fever epidemics in Philadelphia in the 1790s, and thought there might be something there. And before we knew what we were doing, we found a heck of a lot, because one thing led to another. So we're going to take you really from the 1790s up to well, at least 1989 before this is over. So we should probably get going. Let us begin by talking about what yellow fever is. Consensus on its origin is that it's from Africa. The most likely date for the earliest Western Hemisphere epidemic would be 1645 in the West Indies. The first outbreak in the future United States. Ms. Elliott, would you like to talk about that one?
Sure, yeah. So as you can see on the slide there, Boston is actually one of the first epidemic outbreaks that occurs in North America, really. There were a few earlier that are suspected to maybe be yellow fever, but they might not be. One in 1668 in New York, and then one in 1669 in Philadelphia. But the first confirmed epidemic of yellow fever occurred here or nearby in Boston in 1693. Now, the last epidemic, as you can see up on the screen there, occurred in New Orleans in 1905. This corresponded to the virus's discovery as being mosquito-borne, which I believe will correspond to the next slide.
I believe so. We're going to find the little creature responsible for all of this.
Yes, that little tiny little nuisance that causes so many troubles for people. But on top of being just plain old annoying, turns out these little critters also carry deadly diseases, or so we discovered or so Walter Reed discovered in 1905, when it was finally confirmed positively that mosquitoes do carry diseases. Now, in terms of yellow fever, a very particular type of breed of mosquito is the sort of preferred carrier. That's being and apologize for my pronunciation here, the Aedes aegypti. It's a particular family of mosquito that just happens to be one of the best carriers for this particular type of disease.
The other thing about that is it also gets even more particular than that. It is only the female of the species feeds, so it has to be a female mosquito. And then for it to transmit the disease, it has to bite someone who already has the disease. It has to bite them within the first 3 or 4 days of they having been infected with the disease, and then it has to incubate the disease inside itself for about 2 weeks before it is going to transmit it by biting somebody else. So it's not surprising that people took a long time to figure this out. And that gets us to why it was so frightening for people. It wasn't necessarily the most deadly disease if you just counted up the number of people who died in, in total numbers, but it had a particular kind of terror to it. First of all, because it was mosquito-borne, it tended to be in cities. It tended to be in populated areas because the mosquito had to get it, move on to somebody else, give it to them, and so forth. So populated areas were more likely. The disease was particularly nasty in its manifestations. And Alexandra, do you want to do the kind of course of the disease?
Sure, I'll take the graphic details here. So in terms of the progression of yellow fever, it is typically an incubation period of about 3 to 6 days. And then after which the first symptoms will appear. Now you can kind of see on the left-hand side of your screen a very handsome looking young man, full of life, and probably just got a mosquito bite a couple days ago. But after a few days, he starts to look closer to the second picture there, and has very high fever, is starting to feel a little bit nauseous. And then after that, is sort of feeling some chills as well. After that, we'll start to feel some aching muscles in his back. This is usually, this is of course not very discernible from many other diseases that you might have. That could just be a very bad flu. But after that, you will start to see some of the more severe symptoms. In about 15% of the cases, the fever will come back after it has started to get better, at which point you will start to have, or victims will start to have abdominal pain and liver damage. And this is where yellow fever actually gets its name, is from, as you can see in that third picture, jaundice. So the liver has started to take on damage. Some of the chemicals that the liver usually breaks down for the body is starting to build up in the skin, and thus you get that sort of jaundiced yellow color in the eyes especially, but also in the skin. And this is, of course, a symptom of the liver damage. And then this is usually a very bad sign. About 50% of those who develop jaundice would go on to the more severe symptoms and would usually lead to death. And more severe symptoms, there would be bleeding, usually from the mouth and the nose, then progressively from the eyes, and eventually there would be internal bleeding. And so there would be some of the different names in different languages for this disease translate to essentially black vomit, which is characteristic of the internal bleeding, and thus what happens in that case. There's also, of course, quite a lot of delirium. It is, to say the least, a very graphic disease. It would be quite harrowing to witness someone that you love or just a total stranger going through these symptoms. It is quite a horror, to say the least.
We had meant to warn people, since we were so popular at the dinner hour, about what some of the stuff might be like, but there's more to come, although this was one of the worst things about it. Because it is only mosquito-borne, that's the only way really it gets transmitted. The assumption is that in Africa, it moved from primate to human by mosquito biting a monkey and then turning around and biting a human. But because of that, to keep going the way it does, it is dependent on new people coming in who are potentially already carrying the disease. So it is a byproduct of trade, and then in a very distinct and very real kind of way, it is also a byproduct of slavery, because obviously the human cargo being brought on the Middle Passage from Africa to the Western Hemisphere was a just prime material for any mosquitoes that happened to be stowaways on the boats. So in many sorts of ways, it not only struck physical terror and concern for people, but it also, even when people didn't have the information to make all the connections, I think on some level, it struck their subconscious, it struck their kind of imaginative life, their kind of dream life. And that's part of what we're going to be looking at tonight, as well as the actual progress of the disease. This is actually the wharf at Philadelphia where the 1793 epidemic that we're going to be talking about in a minute actually began. There were epidemics throughout the 19th century in all sorts of cities, particularly south of the Mason-Dixon line, but on numerous occasions, including the 1790s, as far north as New York. New York got hit several times, and there would often be simultaneous epidemics. But because of the nature of the transmission, it was always a series of epidemics happening at the same time rather than a pandemic, such as the situation that we're having to deal with today. So it really enters our American consciousness and really kind of gets underway in Philadelphia, where the decade of the 1790s is a decade in which yellow fever recurs almost yearly. 1793 is highlighted in red because it is by far the worst year. But it continues really and past 1799. Well, thank you.
Sorry about that. I meant to turn that on earlier. I just realized. So,
okay.
Yeah, sorry.
And we could have, we could just keep the dates going because it went, much longer than that. But these are the ones that are immediately also tie us to our native son, John Adams. Because, of course, John Adams is vice president in 1793. Here's an artist rendering of George Washington's first inauguration with Adams here to his right as.
You may want to hit the continue button so that we can see that image fully.
I did hit the continue button. Where are we? What's happening? What are we not seeing?
Oh, I hadn't hit the continue button. Apologies for that interruption.
Is anybody else having trouble? Just say so.
Yes.
Because I can only see, right now I only see the.
Should be all set.
But okay, so it's a.
Yep, I think you're good, Ed. I just wanted, if you want to take questions, there's been one question, but we can wait until you're ready for them. So just let me know how.
Yeah, that might be the better way because we got a lot of territory to cover.
Okay, great.
Okay, so Adams is vice president when the 1793 epidemic strikes. However, he is not in Philadelphia. Neither he nor Abigail are in Philadelphia. The epidemic begins in August of 1793. It officially gets called in around August 19th, but probably people were starting to get sick by August 1st. Adams and Abigail had left Philadelphia and come back here to Quincy as early as March, and they simply stayed away until November. However, a number of the other offices, Washington was there when it began, and Jefferson was living out in the suburbs just beyond the city limits. Alexander Hamilton was there. And most importantly, the man who was in the middle of dealing with the crisis was Adams's good friend and co-signer with Adams of the Declaration of Independence, Dr. Benjamin Rush, possibly the most distinguished medical man of his day. Rush threw himself into this with absolute manic devotion, seeing 140, 120 patients a day when it was at its height, going without sleep, working around the clock, with what we would have to say is somewhat mixed results. Alexandra, do you want to talk about, how do you feel? Do you want to do something about the different theories of how to treat the disease? Different things
I can talk about that. So in terms of the different theories about how to actually confront the disease and how to actually treat it, there were two main schools of thought, one of which was headed by sort of some of the more established, or some of the other establishment doctors of Philadelphia, and then the other by Dr. Benjamin Rush and some of his colleagues. The first one being headed up by some of the city doctors were sort of more emulating palliative care, so really emphasizing bed rest, fluids, and nutrition, the sorts of advice that you might see for a flu or a cold today. as being the most useful way to treat a disease. Essentially, give the body enough nutrition and rest to be able to naturally fight it off itself. And then Dr. Benjamin Rush, however, was looking at the severity of this disease and was thinking, well, it must need a very aggressive treatment to be able to deal with it. And so he was advocating for treatments such as bloodletting and purging, purging being more or less exactly what it sounds like, and really push these types of care very, very strongly. And in fact, Rush's methods became the standard for treating fevers for roughly the next 50 years. And I believe that this was even some of the same methods that were used to treat Washington at the end of his life, for a fever that he had towards the end of his life.
Yeah, the man who bled Washington, actually, I don't remember his name, but he was actually in Philadelphia treating patients during the epidemic. And Rush really took it to an extreme. He found, when he got very frustrated when nothing, as the cases just kept mounting, and he'd gone through all the classic works, he went to a text, a more obscure text that really advocated extreme purging and bloodletting, which was complicated by the fact that they thought that there was twice as much blood in the human body as there actually is. So it was really quite extreme. And that became the first really big controversy, what Alexandra was describing. The two controversies were what was causing it. There was a theory that it was just like rot. It was just spontaneously growing out of rotting, particularly pile of rotting coffee on the wharf, and other people claiming that people were bringing, that it had to come in with people. There were refugees, a number of French refugees who were fleeing a slave revolt in Santo Domingo who had been arriving in considerable numbers. And in fact, because it obviously cannot spontaneously generate, it clearly probably did come in on either the refugees or on another boat. So there was that dispute, and then there was the palliative care versus the bleeding and purging care approach. In either way, it wasn't going well. The cases just kept mounting up. People were dying. The social structure was beginning to collapse. The almshouse refused to take in yellow fever victims because they were afraid they were simply going to infect all the what healthy residents there were in the almshouse, of the paupers that were normally living there. A number of wealthy people, including and well-to-do people who could leave, did, including some of the medical community. The overseers and the guardians of the poor, a number of the senior people of that left, leaving only young people, some of the younger members. They began to get sick themselves. Things were going bad, from bad to worse. The guardians of the poor finally decided they had to create a lazaretto, a place to put yellow fever victims, and only yellow fever victims. And they choose this building on the outskirts of town. The caption says Hamilton residence. It has nothing to do with Alexander Hamilton. This was owned by a man named William Hamilton. It was called Bush Hill, and in fact, it had been the home in Philadelphia of John and Abigail Adams. They had rented it during the first 2 years of Adams's vice presidency, but had gone elsewhere the last couple of years. So the Guardians simply appropriated the building. They never asked Mr. Hamilton anything, any questions or any permission. They just took it because he had left. He had been an absentee landlord. It became a notorious nightmarish place in about 3 or 4 weeks because there was no level of professional care. At this point, Rush, in the opinion of the sort of standard historian of the Philadelphia epidemic, even though he is probably performing the wrong procedure in trying to cure people, and clearly bleeding people is not, we know, a good idea, is actually providing a certain amount of stability because he is staying, even though he is working himself to a frazzle. He winds up, his sister, who lives with him, gets the disease and dies. A number of his young medical assistants, his young doctors, get the disease. A number of them die. People, personal servants of his die. Eventually, he himself gets the fever and is prostrate. is actually flat on his back, despite the fact that he keeps trying to get up and get to work during the absolute height of the disease. But that in itself is a source of comfort and stability just on the basis of the amazing reputation that the man has. What does happen, though, is the mayor of Philadelphia, who's really kind of been abandoned by the governor, begins to decide that he's got to do something. Society is collapsing. The civil government has really kind of collapsed. He turns to assemble a committee of leading men, or men who are willing to stay, of whom Stephen Girard, the banker whom we're looking at now, is the kind of natural leader. They really wind up only being about 12 of them. And as of September 15th, they really take over care of the city. And in a kind of major action, they bring adequate medical care to Bush Hill, to the Lazaretto House. And it is not in Rush's style, Rush's style. Girard gives it to gives the job to a French emigre physician named Jean Davis, who is very much the French school of treatment is much more palliative care, gentle treatment. So that becomes the treatment at Bush Hill. But as this group kind of spreads out, they begin to introduce some element of stability into the city at the same, even as the disease reaches its height. They are also not an elite group. The man who works most closely and does the most besides the banker, Stephen Girard, is a man named Peter Helm, who is a cooper. He's a barrel maker. He's an artisan. But between the two of them, they work together, and with about 10 other guys, keep the city going. But even before September 15th, and these men have stepped forward, another part of the community has stepped forward, which is the Free African community, led by two men, the Reverend Absalom Jones, who we see here, and the Reverend Richard Allen, who we see here. Absalom Jones is an Episcopal. Let me see. I want to see if I can go back. We go back to Absalom Jones. Absalom Jones is a Episcopal minister. Richard Allen is a Methodist minister. Absalom Jones will become the first ordained Episcopal priest in the United States. Absalom Jones will become the first Methodist minister, Methodist bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Church in America. But at the time, they are building their own African congregations because they have been unceremoniously treated at the white Episcopal Church. They've been busy with that when the epidemic strikes. They come to Clarkson and offer their services on September 5th and become absolutely vital in saving the city. The African Free Society, of which they are the leaders, takes on all the jobs that need to be done: the carting of the dead, the cleaning, the burying, everything that needs to be done. Everything, they put everything on hold. They are encouraged to do this in part by Dr. Rush, also in part because Rush has a erroneous but very widespread belief that Africans are immune to the disease, which may come from the possibility that at some point more Africans had experienced the disease in their young years and survived and therefore had an immunity. This is really an important part of the story because after the epidemic is over and everybody begins telling their story and grinding their axe, Matthew Carey, who in many other respects is a very admirable character, he's a Irish immigrant. He was a rebel in Ireland who had to get out of Ireland and came to Philadelphia. Publishes this booklet. He is by trade a printer and publisher. I won't read the whole title because we've only got an hour and a half, but it attempts to describe what happened during the plague in Philadelphia. And at one point, he criticizes the African Americans for profiteering. Reverend Jones and Reverend Allen decide they are not going to sit for this, and they publish a refutation, making this one of the earliest African-American publications and writings in our history, or at least within the national history, in which they are very, very point by point take Carey's accusations apart. Few other things happened. Well, actually, Alexandra, anything on this that you would like to add to that part of the story?
So just kind of going back to a little bit about the African-American community being considered immune to the disease. This actually dates back to some observations that Rush had read from a yellow fever epidemic in one of the Carolinas, I'm blanking on exactly which one, in which it was observed that slaves from Africa did have more immunity, exactly for the reasons that you said. Now, this rumor, essentially, of course, does not carry over to the free communities in that were born and grew up in North America. They did not have those immunities, since those immunities are not generational. They do not pass down to subsequent generations. So this rumor about African Americans being immune to yellow fever is widespread and becomes quite pernicious in the middle half of the 19th century. So around the time of the Civil War, you really do get. I'll talk about that a little bit more later, but that comes up again, and even after that rumor has been debunked, it still continues to be used.
Meanwhile, a few other things have been happening. Alexander Hamilton has actually gotten yellow fever in the middle of all of this, and obviously survives, as we all know. And he, after that, does leave the city and seek a safer place. Washington leaves the city on September 10th, which winds up being somewhat controversial, although he had done this every year that he had been president and been in Philadelphia. He had left around that time to go back to Mount Vernon, and he did it with some reluctance, but felt there were real overriding family needs for why he had to leave. Nevertheless, it did not exactly instill a lot of confidence in the public. John and Abigail's son, Thomas Boylston, is actually in Philadelphia this summer studying for the law with Jared Ingersoll, and he stays for a fair amount of time and then does leave and go out to the country. And the one that really is kind of, I'm going to take the minute to indulge in this. There is a let's see if I can remember the name. Yeah, John Todd. There's a young Quaker named John Todd who has married a beautiful young woman named Dolly Payne, and they're living in Philadelphia. He has sent Dolly, who is pregnant, and their young child out to safety. He has remained in the city. John Todd becomes ill, is sure he's going to die, and against all his better judgment, because he loves Dolly so much, he goes to try and see her one last time, gets there, expires on the doorstep saying, "I just had to see you one more time." Dolly does become ill, although of course she did not really catch it from her husband, because you can't. The baby dies, the newborn baby dies, but the older child survives. Dolly and her mother go back to Philadelphia. The mother begins taking in boarders in the house. They begin to attract attention. Aaron Burr, this is long after that, but Aaron Burr notices Dolly and says, "I have a friend I think you might want to meet," and he introduces her to James Madison, and Dolly, the yellow fever survivor, becomes Dolly Madison. Anyway, that is neither here nor there, but when I found that, I couldn't resist it. By late October, it's beginning to ease up, and by November, Washington is wondering whether they can really convene the Congress or not. But by November, it has calmed down enough so that eventually the Congress does come back. Thomas Boylston goes back to the city. He writes to John and Abigail and tells them, yeah, it's okay to come back now, and they return. But John is obviously not done with the yellow fever yet, because it will keep coming back during his presidency. So in 1797, the first year of his presidency, he is writing from here in Quincy in the late summer into the fall to people like Secretary of State Pickering and to Secretary of the Treasury Walcott, asking, can we come back? Is this going to work? Can we convene Congress or not this fall in Philadelphia? Do we need to try and find some other arrangement? Eventually, the disease is not severe enough and calms down enough that he is able to do so. But in his first message to Congress as president, Adams actually begins by saying, I thought we might not be able to meet here in Philadelphia. And he has to do this again in 1798 and in 1799, again ask, is it safe to come back? In 1799, in fact, they do actually meet for a while and hold the government in Trenton, New Jersey, rather than in Philadelphia, because the disease is bad enough. But it's really in the time after he's president. It's when he's back here in Quincy, sort of thinking about his life, and to some people would say sort of stewing over some of the things in his life, that he says the most about yellow fever in letters to people with whom he has experienced it. He writes, for instance, to Benjamin Rush at various times in the early 1800s. Rush is, by the way, publishing a great deal, trying to defend his theory of the disease and his theory of treatment. So in 1805, Adams actually, in a letter to Rush, says, I'm fully convinced that the yellow fever sometimes, and indeed often, is generated in many places in America, especially in our great cities, by natural causes of putrefaction. So he is supporting Rush's theory of the origin. But he qualifies and he says, but I'm not yet quite clear that it is not contagious or that it might not frequently be imported. I am for cleansing the cities with all possible industry, and at the same time for maintaining quarantine laws to keep it out from abroad. And then he says, but of course I don't really, I'm not a medical man, so you know better than I do. Interestingly enough, he's been talking to, just before this in the letter, he's been writing to Rush about the French and the French Revolution and Napoleon Bonaparte and things like that. And that connection with the French and yellow fever seems to keep coming up in his writing about it. Keep in mind that in addition to arguments about the nature of yellow fever, there's been a really vigorous political argument going on since 1793, and maybe even a little bit before that, between the pro-English Federalists and the pro-French Jeffersonian Democrat Republicans. That neither side really aligns with the theory of the disease or the theory of the treatment of the disease, but those political arguments keep coming back up and kind of shading how people see the disease itself. Adams, excuse me, when he, in what is perhaps not John Adams' finest moment, we maybe don't remember quite as much as we used to, that there could be a kind of nasty side to Adams. In another letter a couple of years later to Rush, he is saying, well, I'm not a vindictive man. I don't hold grudges. And then he begins to list everything bad that happened to everybody, whoever, did him dirt. And several of them he singles out because the yellow fever has gotten them. He mentions a Mr. Greenleaf, a printer of a Jacobin paper in New York, who filled his columns for years with libelous paragraphs against me. He was at length carried off by the yellow fever. Benjamin Bache In revenge for Washington's neglect of his father and his family, he was converted from a zealous Federalist to an abandoned Jacobin and became, of course, the most malicious libelers of me. But the yellow fever also arrested him in his detestable career and sent him to his grandfather, from whom he inherited a dirty, envious, jealous, and revengeful spite against me. And there's yet a third one there that he uses. He also mentions to Rush in 1807 that the yellow fever just seems to be going on forever. He sympathizes with Rush that they don't seem to be able to get a handle on it. But the connection with the French and the notion of the disease is somehow caught up as something not just a physical thing, but a moral quality to it, keeps coming up. And the most remarkable one is a letter he writes to Thomas Jefferson, of all people, in 1813, when they're discussing the French Revolution and what's happened to the French Revolution and Bonaparte and all of that, and other cases of terrorism. And he says to Jefferson, "You certainly never felt the terrorism excited by Genet in 1793, when 10,000 people in the streets of Philadelphia, day after day, threatened to drag Washington out of his house and effect a revolution in the government, or compel it to declare war in favor of the French Revolution and against England. The coolest and finest minds, even among the Quakers in Philadelphia, have given their opinions to me that nothing but the yellow fever, which removed Dr. Hutchinson and Jonathan Dickinson Sargent from this world, could have saved the United States from a total revolution of government." The foremost historian of the Philadelphia epidemic said, Adams there is overstating the case, as he is wont to do at times. But Adams is seeing, I wouldn't say the fever as a deliverer, although in fact that is what he is saying at the moment. And that political tension, it seems to color a lot of the early views of the fever and the epidemic, most notably in the first literary works, which are by this gentleman. This is a picture of Charles Brockden Brown. I don't know how many people have heard of Charles Brockden Brown. If you were an English major, there's a good chance that you did hear of him. And there's even a fair chance that you've probably read one of his novels. He is really the first person in America to try and earn his living as a writer. And he turned out, in the space of about really 2 or 3 years, 6 or 7 novels that he was writing simultaneously with one another. In the period, actually, at the end of Adams's presidency, he is publishing these books, or at least begins publishing them, while Adams is in office in 1799 and 1800. He is a Philadelphian. He was in Philadelphia during the initial days of the epidemic in 1793, before he went to New York, where the epidemic was milder, to pursue literary efforts. He moved in a more radical pro-French circle. He was much more of a Democrat Republican, maybe even more radical than that. He was kind of a proto-feminist. He was very interested in the English writer Mary Wollstonecraft and her vindication of the rights of women. He was interested in the radical theories of William Godwin, the English writer. And his novels really, particularly his first novel, or the first novel we're going to talk about, really try and imitate Godwin in using the novel as a way to kind of try and convey political and social ideas. So he's a serious novelist. He's a novelist that was taken seriously. Many of the early American writers did know and admire him. He is a little bit tough to take nowadays. There are people who think he's terrific. There are people who find him really maybe more than they want to handle, but there is an undoubted power to his writing. And in at least 2 of those novels, written almost contemporaneously with events, he deals with the epidemic of 1793. The first is the book Ormond, or The Secret Witness. You'll notice in this 1811 edition, they got his initials in the wrong order over there in England, where this title page came from. Ormond is the book that is most directly imitating Godwin. It's a novel, like a lot of English novels in which there is a heroine who is being beset by misfortunes and by men whose intentions are not entirely noble. But the heroine of this novel, Constance Dudley, really kind of kicks ass, basically. I mean, she, unlike Clarissa, Richardson's Clarissa, who, you know, dies when she, or his Pamela, who winds up getting the guy to marry her, she tends to stand her ground. The story involves she and her father have fallen from middle-class life to poverty because they have been betrayed by a unscrupulous assistant to the father, who the father has run an apothecary shop in Manhattan, and he's been bankrupted by this guy who's run off with all the money. And they've gone to Philadelphia, where they're living in abject, you know, hand-to-mouth kind of poverty in the poor sections when the fever hits. One of the things that we should say about Brown is that he is obsessed with this notion of something that becomes a real motif in American literature, particularly American literature of the 19th and early 20th century. The character who is not what he seems. The person who pretends to be somebody else, who adopts a false identity, the person who is somehow a con man, the person who is a masquerader of one kind or another. And Ormond, the title character, is exactly that kind of person, as is the person who has betrayed Constance's father. All of this in Ormond is working towards a sort of economic criticism in which the rich are exploiting the poor. Having been forced into poverty, Constance now has to deal with the effects of poverty. And as the epidemic strikes, she really experiences it initially as both a tragedy, but also as an economic experience. Her father says to her, as they begin, she learns about it really because she has to take the rent to the landlord. And when she gets to the landlord's house, she's told the landlord has died of yellow fever. From that point, it begins, you know, the fever begins to close in on them as it spreads through Philadelphia. Her father says, for the rich, the entire world is an almshouse. They can run anywhere, but we can run nowhere. And that becomes kind of the theme. And the treatment of the disease, unlike the next novel we're going to talk about, is very realistic. Constance goes to the neighbors next door. They haven't been seen for a day or so. It's a brother and a sister. She goes next door. The brother has died. The sister is dying. She cares for the sister. He very realistically picks up on some of the things that have been we've talked about already in the objective reality of Philadelphia, the belief that the French are somehow immune. The sister eventually passes away with a great deal of very realistic, but not over the top description. We will spare it to you because it is quite vivid, but it is really, for 1798, it kind of takes you aback at how graphic he is about the details of the disease. And Brown does, writing in 1799 about 1793, Brown does the Free African Society a justice. When the young woman dies and Constance has now 2 dead bodies in a house and no money, she goes out, she hears a hearse passing, she goes out into the street, and it is in fact, the book says 2 Negroes, but obviously 2 African Americans who are fulfilling the need that has been set up. And she tells them the situation, and they behave honorably. They tell her, well, we're carrying a body now, but we'll come back. And in fact, they do, and everything, is done correctly. It's only about 50 pages of the book. She goes on to other adventures and other problems, but it kind of sets the tone, and it puts the radical spin on the epidemic, that the epidemic is another sign of social injustice. There is it's not itself social injustice, but its manifestations are another sign of social injustice. The second novel that he wrote, which he's actually writing at the same time he's writing the first, Arthur Mervyn, is quite different. I mean, Brown is often described as a Gothic novelist, and this one really is Gothic. Unlike Constance, who is there from the beginning, a city girl who is living in the city, Mervyn is the kid from the country. He has a family dispute. He's a farm boy. He wanders into Philadelphia. He's the innocent in the city. He's the forerunner of any number of other innocents in the city. The forerunner of Robin Molyneux and Hawthorne's Tale, the forerunner of anybody who comes to the city and gets snookered in any number of American stories. And of course, he arrives in the city and he gets snookered. Again, but the novel opens actually with the fever. Brown also loves layers of narrators upon narrators and narrators and stories within stories within stories. So the outermost narrator actually finds Arthur dying of yellow fever on his doorstep. It takes us about, I think, 200 pages to find out that the outermost narrator is a physician, and that is why he has stayed in Philadelphia. But again, Brown is making the ideological points of supporting the people that stayed, the people who did not panic. And he nurses Mervyn back to health, and then Mervyn tells this story that I'm not even going to attempt to summarize because I don't think I could, in which he falls victim not only to a first dissembler, but he falls victim to a master manipulator named Welbeck, who gets him into all sorts of complications. But then he actually leaves the city and then is back living in the country with another family. And as the epidemic breaks out, the boyfriend of one of the daughters of the family that Arthur is living with doesn't come back from Philadelphia. So noble Arthur goes off into the city a second time, even knowing that it's being overrun with the epidemic. And you get this kind of deliberate juxtaposition of Arthur arriving the first time into this bustling city that he is not fit, not capable of dealing with yet as the outside innocent. And Arthur now coming back to a haunted city. All the images are, Brown uses words like ghostly. Every time he enters a house, it's like the classic scene of entering the haunted house and going up the stairs, not knowing what you're going to find. He never sees people directly. He sees them in the mirror. They always appear like apparitions. When he finally finds the missing boyfriend, who by this time he is convinced is dead, he for a moment believes he's actually looking at the reanimated corpse because the guy is wasted with the yellow fever. Both novels take a number of the actual incidents that took place of people trying to flee the city to escape and getting sick and dying by the wayside and being neglected by people in the countryside for fear. Essentially, as the fever abates, Brown goes on to more complications as the stories go on, and really almost endless complications. Even by the time we get to the end of the book at page 400, it looks as though Brown was planning yet another sequel, because he leaves you're never quite sure with Brown whether this is deliberate or whether he just was writing so fast he didn't tie up all his ends. But there's certainly a teaser that something else is going to happen right at the end of the novel. So in this one, it's still economic, it's still kind of radical politics or radical sociology, but it also has a kind of nightmarish quality that we're going to see at other times and in later works. Before we leave Philadelphia, that was a long time. Alexandra, do you want to say anything?
So sort of my last thing that I've come across in terms of the 1793 epidemic is that, and sort of tying into what you've been saying as well, is that it also incorporated into a lot of the conversations, semi-political conversation that was going on in America at the time about whether or not urban living was even a good idea, and whether America really even should have big urban centers. And I think it was Jefferson actually does talk about this to a certain extent, that, well, the yellow fever in Philadelphia is a perfect example of why it's not a great idea. And then as time goes on, especially as Philadelphia is recovering from the series of epidemics that it has in the 1790s, and they start to incorporate all of these new infrastructures, for example, the new waterworks, and incorporating a modern sort of water delivery system to a system of pumps instead of having, cisterns throughout the city. This really does start to mitigate, future pandemic or future epidemics of yellow fever, and really does start to make the case that, oh yeah, no, America can have urban centers and quite large ones as well.
Yes. Okay, we're going to move on to New Orleans, and we will move more quickly. We wanted to spend a lot of time in Philadelphia because it is sort of the seedbed of a lot of stuff, and also because of the connection to the Addams family. But we're going to move on, and we want to get to the movies fairly quickly. So we're going to look at New Orleans, and then we're going to look at Cuba briefly. But as we look at New Orleans, I do want to bring your attention to a really remarkable novel that I think is unjustly neglected. And we'll get to that very quickly, and we'll kind of do the history of the New Orleans epidemics a little bit more quickly. Recurrent epidemics of yellow fever in New Orleans, as you would expect, given its location, given its low position, given the swamps all around it. 1853 was by far the worst. In a city that was probably a little bit over 100,000, at least 8,000 people died that summer. And again, a lot of the kind of woodcut graphics from broadsides and penny magazines you see here of the desolate family, the family just totally wiped out in the picture. There was a second epidemic in 1878. This is a picture from Frank Leslie's magazine showing how deserted the main Canal Street in downtown New Orleans is in 1878. That epidemic, by the way, was very widespread and actually hit all the way up the Mississippi River Valley. Memphis was really, really badly hit by that 1878 epidemic. And in the wake of that 1878 epidemic, a native Louisianan and a Louisianan writer, George Washington Cable, who I meant to double check this, but I believe this is accurate. Cable actually had his own loss in the 1878 epidemic. I believe both a sibling and one of his children died in the 1878 epidemic. He turned to writing a novel that really draws, but in a very different way than Brown, on that kind of experience. Cable was a native-born Louisiana, native-born New Orleans man, but his parents were outsiders. His parents had moved in from outside of Louisiana. They moved in from somewhat more northern climes. He is also, because of that, he is a Northern European. He is not a Creole, although he will wind up writing about the Creoles. He began as a loyal son of the South, and he served in the Confederate Army during the war. But during Reconstruction, and particularly in post-Reconstruction, as he saw things begin to go bad, he changed his sympathies, and he began to argue against the redemptionists. He began to argue against Jim Crow, and began to make that the subject of his stories. He particularly focused on the Creole culture in New Orleans. Creole, in this case, embracing a wide range of basically all the European or partially European people who were there before the annexation by the United States. He was particularly interested in the levels of those within the Creole culture, between the all-white Creole, for want of a better word, I guess you'd have to say mixed race Creole, the Creoles who were potentially partially African and partially European, or partially Native American, partially European, the predominantly African Creole, and then below that, the people who would not be considered Creole, which would be the purely African American slave. But he works all this into what I think is really a remarkable novel that he published in 1880. So he was writing this during the 1878 epidemic, called The Grandissime by George Washington Cable. Now this novel was, this is the, an 18, what is this, somebody can do the Roman numerals, this is 1897. So it's 17 years later. It's still getting a deluxe edition from Scribner's. This was a very popular novel. He was a very influential writer in his time, and for a long time afterwards. And he's just kind of vanished from people's consciousness. But he is a good writer. This is a historical romance with all sorts of levels to it. It takes place. The main story takes place during the period when Louisiana is being acquired by the United States from France. And so New Orleans is transitioning from being a colony into being a territory of the United States. And the Creoles are suddenly finding the new Americans coming in. But it is really about all the levels and all the backstory and all the distortions that come from a slave society. There are essentially 3 or 4 major characters. There is the outsider, Joseph Frauenfeld, who arrives from the outside, who is an American of German, first generation American, second generation American of German heritage, who is the outsider who can comment on the whole thing. And then there are the great families that have been feuding for generations, the Grandissime, the, I'm going to forget how to pronounce this name if I don't look it up, the, I've got it here someplace, I knew I would go, the de Grappin, the Fusilier, and then the de Grappin. So 3 families. But it's not just 3 families, because then there are levels of who's white in the family, who's illegitimate and partially white. And the whole thing just keeps getting more and more complicated. Yellow fever turns up very subtly, unlike Brown, who throws it in your face. It's a romantic novel. So one of the things that happened in New Orleans was that there was a great deal of native immunity, and newcomers did get it. So Frauenfeld, the newcomer who arrives with his entire family, falls ill. He and his entire family fall ill in the first 25 pages of the novel, and he is the only one who survives. And so he's sort of left on his own, making his way and becoming friends with this whole Creole society. It's romantic. These are illustrations from the 1897 edition. These are the classic romantic setup. 2 members, they're at a masquerade ball. What else would you be doing in New Orleans? And they're unmasking. She is a de Grappin. He is a Grandissime, and they don't know that about each other. So they're going to fall in love, and it's going to take 400 pages to work it out. But that's the most, in some ways, trivial aspect of the novel. But it's the engine that keeps it going. And in the midst of all this kind of lush romanticism that you can see in this, it winds up telling a very powerful story. At the core of it, you keep hearing about a character named Bras Coupé. And finally, right at the dead center of the novel, Bras Coupé is dead when the novel begins. We know he's been dead. There are allusions to him. And finally, Frauenfeld gets somebody to tell him the story at the same time that it's being told in 2 other places, the story of Bras Coupé. This is the illustration for the story of Bras Coupé. Bras Coupé the story takes place 7 years earlier, which is very carefully placed because that puts it back in another fever epidemic year. Bras Coupé is a recently captured African. He is an African prince who has been captured. He's gone through the Middle Passage. It is one of the most sarcastic, grimly satirical descriptions of the Middle Passage you will find anywhere. He is brought and he is sold into the Grandissime family, and then sold off to a soon-to-be, or given off to a soon-to-be in-law of the Grandicimes. And because he is a prince and believes he has been captured in war, he is willing to accept his capture, but refuses to work. He is then involved with another fascinating character, a slave woman named Palmyre, who he is brought into. It becomes very complicated. Eventually, the plan is that he and Palmyre will marry, and there's the hope that this will bring him back into the set. Everything goes wrong at the proposed wedding, and he escapes. And this is the scene where he escapes, and he escapes into the mangroves and into the swamps. He's been dressed patronizingly in leftover, pomp and circumstance military gear. So the illustration sort of suggests both the strengths and the weaknesses of it. I mean, it's powerful, and yet it's also somewhat patronizing. Cable recognizes the patronization but can't quite escape it, but winds up still with a remarkably powerful thing. And without trying to tell you the whole thing, Coupé curses the family, and the curse takes the manifestation of the yellow fever. He is eventually captured, and in a horrifying moment, really, is hamstrung. You really hear what hamstrung means, which is obviously the cutting of the tendons so that you can no longer support yourself on your legs. The curse continues at the last moment in his dying breath, presented with the child of his dead enemy. He forgives the curse, which is the scene you see here. This is not giving away anything of the story. This is a very hard novel to find, but I really recommend it to anybody. I found it an absolute revelation, and I made Alexandra read some of it, so I don't know what she thought about it, but what did you think?
I did not read the entire thing. I will preface this with that. I only read, Ed specifically made me read the story of Bras Coupé. And it's definitely very graphic. It has quite a lot of very interesting, very, very Victorian themes in it. It has the sort of Bras Coupé being the emblem of the noble savage. So he's treated as the protagonist. He's clearly the person that you're supposed to be rooting for to a certain extent, but at the same time, he's not. There's a very clear. His customs are looked down upon. His way of doing things is looked down upon, and he's not exactly treated as a fully fledged character in a way that you would expect from a novel from this period.
But I would just, the point I suppose I should make is that this is, even though it's done most subtly, this is the most explicit. This very clearly makes the connection that the fever and slavery are linked, that in some way, symbolically, the fever is a punishment for the sin of slavery. I think, I think that's pretty clear. In the interest of time, we're going to move fast into Cuba. This is, I think everybody actually knows this part of the story, or at least some of the parts of it. This is Major Walter Reed of the U.S. Army Medical Corps. After the Spanish-American War, which the United States won in 1898, the United States took temporary occupation of Cuba. Reed was sent as the head of a team of doctors to try and get a handle on what yellow fever is, because yellow fever, and what could be done about it, because yellow fever is endemic in Cuba. The other members of his team were Jesse Lazier, James Carroll, and a local guy, Aristides Agramonte, who was a Cuban. They are pursuing the mosquito idea, the idea that it is borne by mosquitoes. They do not originate that idea. The idea has been kicking around for a while, is most earnestly advocated by this gentleman, Dr. Carlos Finlay, who's lived his entire life in Cuba, but is Scottish by ethnicity and heritage. His parents came from Scotland. He is still alive, and he is assisting them Reed gets there in June of 1900. They certainly interview Finlay sometime in July of 1900. By the late July of 1900, they are convinced that they think the mosquito theory is correct, but the final complication to yellow fever is that most animals can't get it. So they conclude, the four scientists, the four doctors conclude that they are willing to experiment on humans, including themselves, to see if they can induce yellow fever from mosquito bites, and only mosquito bites, and at the same time prove that it is not transmitted by other means, such as soiled bed clothing from a fever victim and things like that. At that point, Reed has to return to Washington because he is also on a typhoid commission and has to be there to write the final report for that commission. Carroll and Lazaire begin fooling around, begin working with mosquitoes that Finlay has given them, and Carroll doesn't really believe it unless the mosquito bite him and gets sick. Lazaire does believe it unless the mosquito bite him and does get sick. Lazaire dies before Reed gets back. At that point, they decide that they have to do this in a more, Reed decides that they have to do this in a much more consistent way. And that is when they offer volunteers from the United States troops that is there, plus Cuban volunteers. They set up a controlled experiment. And by the end of 1900, by infecting some men and by having other men exposed to the infected bedclothes, are able to demonstrate basically all the salient points of the mosquito transmission. And with that, we are able to control mosquitoes and build the Panama Canal under William Gorgas, and that's a picture beginning in 1906. And we are fumigating the last epidemic in New Orleans in 1905. But it isn't completely over because it passes into our memory, most notably in the 1938 film Jezebel, directed by William Wyler. It is a movie that uses that 1853 epidemic. It's not done, unlike Cable, nobody involved with this is a native Louisianan, and nobody's really even a native Southerner. But it is a remarkable movie in that it takes the yellow fever and the story and makes it not only sort of a symbol for its time, but also a symbol for the time in which the movie is made, for the 1930s. There's a lot of emphasis on reconciliation with the South in the 1930s movies, because partly from the Depression, partly from the need to, the recognition that we are possibly heading towards the Second World War, so the attempt to unify. Jezebel is subtly critical of the South, and it also, of course, gives Bette Davis a chance for a wonderful Academy Award-winning performance. So we're going to look at those two clips of that real fast, and hopefully this is going to work. Keep in mind, this is a black and white film. The plot turns on the fact that she is going to want to wear a red dress to the ball. You're going to see her make the decision, and then we're going to see her at the ball. Watch how a black and white film manages to make the center of your attention a red dress whose color you can't see.
Bring that over here, mademoiselle. Saucy, isn't it? And vulgar. Yes, isn't it? Come on, get me out of this.
Julie, what are you doing?
If it fits me, I'm going to wear it to the Olympus Ball.
A red dress to the Olympus Ball while you're out of your senses?
Mademoiselle, une jeune fille ne porte pas une robe comme ça. D'ailleurs, c'est une robe de cette Marie Vicaire.
That creature, Julie. You heard what Madame Poulin said. That infamous Vickers.
Mary Vickers couldn't possibly do it justice.
Child, you're out of your mind. You know you can't wear red to the Olympus Ball.
Can't I? I'm going to. This is 1852, Dumpling. 1852, not the Dark Ages. Girls don't have to simp around in white just because they're not married.
In New Orleans, they do. Julie, you'd insult every woman on the floor.
Mademoiselle, your aunt, she's right. Look how beautiful this dress is.
Will you kindly get me out of this?
Julie, you can't be serious.
Never more serious in my life.
But Julie, think of press.
That's just exactly what I am thinking of.
Now, the idea, of course, is that she wants to make Henry Fonda her fiancé.
Bring that over here.
No, that's not what we were supposed to do. We weren't going to see this twice. Okay, so the idea is she's going to break the code, wear red to the ball, put Fonda in a precarious position. She's a woman who has more ability and more strength than the society knows what to do with her for, and it keeps coming out in these kind of perverse ways. So the next scene is what happens at the ball.
Hello, Molly. Miss Kendrick. Hello, Dick. Stephen, Jelly.
Stephanie, we must pay our respects to Miss Zimmel. You'll excuse us, please.
Gentlemen, you all have the privilege of Miss Marsden's acquaintance, I think.
Gentlemen.
Miss Marsden.
My respects, ma'am.
Good evening, Buck.
We were just fixing to pour us a little libation.
That's right.
Shall we see you later?
Excuse me. Oh, there's my partner now. Excuse me, please. You haven't a partner you have to meet, Cantrell.
Well, I know. Came alone.
Pleasant evening, isn't it?
Mighty pleasant. Nice and cool.
Do you find it cool in here? I don't find it particularly cool. Do you, Julie?
I know.
I don't find it particularly cool. Miss Julie doesn't find it so.
I know. Now you speak of it, it's just about right.
Seems so to me.
Your servant. Yours, Miss Julie.
Press. I want to leave.
We haven't danced yet, shall we?
No.
Okay. What I'm going to do, just in the interest of time, is I'm going to make two more points about Jezebel quickly with these two stills, and then finish up. We've got just 2 or 3 slides after that, and we'll go quickly through it, and then we'll come back to Jezebel because there are a number of things I think Alexandra would like to say. And we'll just maybe see if we can get some time on it. One of the things that the movie undercuts is the stereotype of the 1930s stereotype of the black slave or the black servant. It uses the stereotypes, but it continually undercuts them. Most notably in this scene, Fonda has spent a year in the North. He comes back. This is Uncle Cato, the trusted lifelong black butler at Julie's mansion. The white people are being served welcome back mint juleps. There were just the two of them in the room at the time, and Fonda asks the butler to join him in a drink, which the butler won't actually drink with him, but says yes, he'll take it back. The second is its treatment of yellow fever. This is a scene of the yellow fever. The yellow fever is introduced early in the movie, and it's kind of hovering in the background. Yellow fever and violence move together in the movie, and what you don't see necessarily coming, but they meet towards the end of the movie. There's violence in the society, and the yellow fever is lurking around the edges, and eventually it's like a vector, and they come together at the 2/3 point of the movie. Less classily than the grande seems, but quite effectively. The fever is again, the symbol of the lack of change, the distorted, corrupt society, but done in a way that you don't quite, you don't have to see it if you don't want to see it if you're looking at the movie, but it's there. And I'd love to be, if we have got a little time, I'd love to be able to come back and talk about that some more. The last two things to talk about, this, we could spend another time, some other time doing this, but it's culturally, the artifacts are the least interesting, although it's a culturally interesting thing. This is a celebratory mural, almost like a kind of heroic pageant, something like you would have seen, like one of those scenes of the fictive pictures of them signing the Declaration of Independence. This is Walter Reed conquering yellow fever, done around 1940. There's Reed, and there's the guy getting the mosquito, and you got 25 people sitting around watching this guy get a mosquito bite. In addition to art like this, there is a play and a movie called Yellow Jack. Yellow Jack is the nickname of the fever, comes from the yellow flag that ships would raise, the warning flag if there was yellow fever on board. A somewhat successful Broadway play and a reasonably successful 1938 movie, same year as Jezebel, about, with a very romantic, heroic depiction of Reed and the enlisted soldiers that volunteer, literally conquering yellow fevers. It also, that play gets done 3 different times on live TV in the great era of live TV of the 1950s. So at that stage, from 1938 to 1950, we moved from this kind of fatalistic or this guilt or to this kind of triumphalist notion about yellow fever, that we've conquered it. And obviously, it's allowed us to build the Panama Canal. It's allowed us to become an international power, that we've conquered it. It's allowed us to go into the warm places of the world. And you can draw your own implications about that and why that maybe didn't last past 1960. And of course, that doesn't last. We found very late something that I wasn't aware of. This is John Edgar Wideman, still quite alive at age 80. He is a very distinguished African-American writer, a Philadelphia native, Philadelphia inner city kid who got to go to the University of Pennsylvania, was until very recently a professor at Brown, and a prodigious novelist and short story writer. In 1989, he made a story about the yellow fever epidemic of 1793 and those Black volunteers, the title story of his short story collection, all of which revolved around Philadelphia themes. And it wouldn't even do this story justice to try. He's a very experimental writer. He's a very modernistic writer. So he's difficult to excerpt, and it really wouldn't do him justice to do it. But you move through multiple voices, times shift, but suddenly you have that story of those Black volunteers from a Black perspective in 1989. So we've kind of come full circle, but we've kind of come out at another place. Still, in some way, the fever and the complexities of the American past remain connected. Okay, so Alexandra, sorry I ran through all of that, but what would you like to add?
So pitching back, I guess, to Jezebel a little bit and sort of having my 5-minute soapbox while we still have a couple more minutes here. Yep. Just to be able to sort of make a pitch for everybody to go and watch that movie, because it is very interesting. It's very much at its core that sort of very stereotypical Southern melodrama, a la Gone with the Wind, but it has a lot to say, a surprising amount to say. I saw it for the first time about a week ago, and I keep on turning scenes over in my head. I keep on going back to it in my mind and just thinking things over. And first of all, Bette Davis gives a phenomenal performance. I mean, she did win an Academy Award for it, so you can imagine that. But but Julie, the character that she's playing, just really is so interesting. Interesting in a way that you don't really see many female characters portrayed in movies today. You never really know what to think about her. When she's first introduced, she is immensely lovable, and she's like, oh wow, she's great, and then just she does some really horrible things over the course of the movie, so you're not quite sure what to think about her. And then by the end, you're right around again. So she really is Julie is a very, very interesting character. In fact, Bette Davis, in one of the promotional videos or promotional pieces for the movie, describes Julie as she's the belle of New Orleans, a very headstrong girl who has no regard for conventions, and she can be the meanest girl in the world one moment and the most lovable the next. And she makes plenty of trouble for any man brave enough to fall in love with her. And that's a really good summary of Julie as a character. And it just in terms of the rest of the movie, the way that they sort of have yellow fever throughout the entire thing, and just sort of building the tension is very well done. And the director has a really phenomenal ability to pack every single scene with all these little details that you're not going to notice on the first go round, but you could watch it 5 or 6 times and probably notice something different each time.
You could actually demonstrate that right now. Watch The Black Maid. You keep talking. And watch The Black Maid behind the first Black Maid. Oh, never mind. Sorry. Never mind, as Emily Lotella would say. It starts further in than I thought. I misremembered it. Never mind.
But yes, at the beginning of that scene, the first person to actually see the dress is the maid, the black woman, who actually takes off her jacket, and she's the first one to react with some consternation about, oh my God, that's a red dress. What are you doing? And so it's the kind of thing that if you're looking at Bette Davis and Fonda in that scene, you're going to miss it. But yet at the same time, she's perfectly in focus. And so if you're looking for it, you can see her. So there's lots of just little details like that, which are very well done. And I will say, without giving away the ending, it is ambiguous what the ending actually is, and what actually happens to the characters. So just as a warning for anyone who doesn't like that kind of movie where you have to kind of think about it. If that's not your cup of tea, then maybe give this one a miss, but I quite enjoy that myself. So I quite liked it, but Julie's story has come to an ending, to a natural ending, even though you're not quite sure what happens.
Yeah, we might just, one last credit on this, and I know we're running very late. John Huston, who was one of the great movie ironists of all time, had a hand in the screenplay. And I think that shows up in all sorts of ways in here that we could spend another hour talking about. But go ahead. Okay, Clayton, we'll stop talking, honest, really.
So yeah, I think we're ready for questions if anybody has them at this point. If we still have time for questions at this point.
Great. There have been a couple of questions. The first question, and I should encourage people at this point, if you think of additional questions as I'm talking or have been holding your questions here till the end, please use the chat streams to communicate them to me, or do it on YouTube or on Facebook. The first question came pretty early on, was you just trying to understand the mechanics of the yellow fever and how it kept coming back every summer. Were the mosquitoes basically holding it over the winter,
No.
Or how did it work?
No, that seems the sort of the best. If anybody wants to read about this, there's a book called Yellow Jack. It's not the Yellow Jack I was talking about, not the movie. there's a book called Yellow Jack that's written by a guy who was actually a doctor at Walter Reed for a long time. And it kind of goes over that. No, the assumption is that you have to keep getting fresh recruits. Somebody has to be coming in carrying the disease and carrying the disease at that moment in time when it will work for the mosquito to bite him and it will be viable. So yes, the people who said it was the people coming in on the boats in Philadelphia were right. Otherwise, yes, it would. If you don't get that, then it dies out. Yeah. And
so it would basically die every winter because people who would get it would die, and then somebody new would bring in, and then mosquitoes would bite that person, and then infect other folks.
And whenever there would be an epidemic occurring, usually it would last through the warmer months, and then as soon as there was a hard frost in late October, early November, that is when you would really see the number of cases die down, when the mosquitoes die.
Wow. So another question. So we went from 1793 to 1853, but we were in Philadelphia. When we last met in public, we were talking about the influenza of 1918. So I guess I was getting confused. So did Philadelphia, like I just remember when we were talking about Philadelphia that the mosquitoes, or that they basically let people out too early, and they had that big march in Philadelphia, and a whole bunch of people got sick with influenza after that.
Yeah.
Was there any lessons learned? Did they talk in Philadelphia about lessons that they learned from the yellow fever that then was relevant to the other outbreaks that they suffered? Is there any tie there, or am I?
The short answer is I don't know. I don't know whether Alexandra came across it, but I think my guess is probably not. It's almost the other way around, because people were scared of stuff happening that, because of the nature of the transmission, couldn't happen. So I mean, unlike COVID, where it's airborne, and just if we were all sitting in a room together, we would be at considerable risk just even doing this. With yellow fever, one of us could have it, and as long as no mosquito got into the room, we'd be just hunky-dory fine.
Okay.
Sort of adding on to that a little bit. Yeah, in my research about the 1918 pandemic, I did not come across, to be fair, I was not focusing too much on Philadelphia. I was more interested in Boston and Massachusetts and Quincy specifically. But I did look a little bit at Philadelphia, and I didn't see too much. Just the ways in which the two diseases are spread are just so completely different. The only real thing that I can think of is that, in Philadelphia in 1793, you have some of the same sort of fumbling for, okay, maybe this will work, and the same sorts of trial and error in terms of dealing with the outbreak. Like, for example, I found a couple instances of some recommendations given by the city to its citizens, and they're warned to avoid fatigue, hot sun, night air, and too much liquor, which is something that was also, to a certain extent, advised of influenza patients. But then also, because it was thought that and especially by Dr. Rush, it was thought that the yellow fever was spread through miasmas, so foul air. It was said that everybody should be carrying vinegar and camphor oil in their handkerchiefs to essentially keep out the bad air. Then you also have things such as reducing public gatherings, actively cleaning the streets and wharves, and then measures such as burning tar and exploding gunpowder in order to disturb the air and hopefully disperse the particles. Now, some of those obviously are going to work better than others, but it's similar in that it's with something new and something drastic and something really almost apocalyptic feeling, you're going to throw everything at the wall and see what sticks.
Yeah.
And some of those things would have kept the bugs away too. So,
right.
Funny.
Some of those things do work.
Right.
Yeah. So I guess the final question is, when I was going and looking even for images when we were talking about this, I saw that yellow fever it still exists. There are mosquitoes still carrying, you could get infected with yellow fever today. So maybe, I don't know if you have anything to say for folks who may be traveling. I don't think we've seen a case of yellow fever in North America in quite some time, but.
Not for a very long while.
Actually, the Yellow Jack book, which I think came out in the early 2000s, mentions a guy dying in Texas of it, like in the late 1990s. But that he caught it. He had been upriver someplace in South America on a hunting trip, and so he caught it there and came back with it. There is a book that I don't remember the title. There is a history written in recent years of the yellow fever epidemic. That then the subtitle is "And How It Could Strike Again." There is no cure. There is a vaccine, but there is no cure. I mean, the treatment really wouldn't be too much, and it's a virus. So.
And the mosquito, was the mosquito coast named? I mean, it's obviously named for mosquitoes, but did it become really feared because of an association between the yellow fever and the mosquitoes there? I don't know.
It could be.
I would also say not necessarily just yellow fever, but also malaria, dengue fever, these other types of diseases that are also mosquito-borne. A lot of these diseases have a very similar history and track record in terms of being feared, although yellow fever had a particular influence on American psyche, as we've been talking about tonight.
And was clearly intrinsically linked with people coming over from it being brought over enslaved from Africa through the Caribbean.
Absolutely.
So, Well, thank you both very much. I'm sure we can continue, and this is a fascinating topic, and there's obviously a lot more to go into. I'm sure there's a lot more literature. The histories of New Orleans and Philadelphia are fascinating. Thank you just so much. You must be tired. You've been talking for a long time. So you're not showing fatigue at all, but I do want to respect your time and the time of all of our listeners. And just thank you everybody for joining us tonight. It's been fabulous having you here. And I look forward to doing this again with future topics. We are looking at a very different theme for the next time we get together. Ed and Alexandra, I don't know if you want to give a teaser for folks what to expect the next time, and we can kind of leave them with that, what to look forward to.
We're lightening it up, definitely.
That's right. Yeah.
Alexandra can explain.
Well, to give a little bit of a teaser, I don't want to get too far into it, but I will give you a hint. It has something to do with a very particular brand from here in Quincy, very well beloved, with orange roofs and 28 flavors of ice cream.
Ice cream. Well, I'm sure that's going to be a ton of fun too, on a very different note. So thank you so much. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you.
I wish everybody a wonderful evening.
And thank you everyone for sticking with us.
Thank you all.
Yes.